Oh yeah, if you hate the system so much, why don't you come up with a better idea? That's what people say to me all the time. That's why on my podcast, Under the Skin on Luminary, I have conversations every week to discuss new ideas and how we can enact real change locally and globally. In this conversation with Sarah Chayes, I talk about anarcho-syndicalism. Is it a realistic proposition? Can we change centralised governmental forces? Can we get beyond the old divisions of left and right? We talked about how GDP growth, the growth of your national wealth, is a kind of busted flush of a measurement. Have a look at this clip between me and Sarah Chayes, a conversation that originally happened on my podcast Under the Skin on Luminary, and stay to the end to tell me what you think, because I reckon she's a brilliant and innovative thinker. She lived in Afghanistan. She advised the Pentagon. She's seen real stuff. She's been deep inside the system. Stay with me, have a look at this, study it, and tell me at the end what you think about it.
I wondered if this idea of breaking things down and sort of, in a sense, something as radical as the abandonment of certain economic principles that people don't like to countenance. I wonder if you, from your experience advising in government and working with these people, do you think that has merit, that kind of way of thinking?
I think it does have merit. I don't think many of the elites that I have advised would say that it has merit. So that's the distinction. It's fascinating what you're saying. I went back when I wrote my most recent book on corruption in America to look at the last time in history that the world seemed to be so in the grip of these transnational, integrated, corrupt or even kleptocratic networks. And I found the period between about 1870 and about 1935. And I hadn't expected to spend as much time and effort on that period of time as I ended up doing, because I found it so interesting, because the parallels were almost identical. But at the time, there was a much greater consciousness of this kind of networked corruption as the enemy on the part of most ordinary people. So I focused on the United States, but I think the same is true in the UK and the rest of Europe, that there were very sophisticated and courageous opposition movements, including the labor movement, and then including also political movements that were actually raising a lot of the issues you just did, including, and you said you're not an primitivist? One of the really interesting movements was the anarchist movement. And what's fascinating is we all assume that they wanted no government. And that's not what they wanted at all. They wanted something much closer to what you're talking about, what they called a cooperative commonwealth, where, different branches of industry would be owned by the people who worked in them and would interact through, representative delegations and things like that. And I don't think their model for a different type of economy was that thoroughly, carefully blueprinted, but it certainly was along the lines of what you're suggesting. And the other thing that's interesting is many of the reforms that they and the labor unions and another movement in the United States, which was farmers, way off in the countryside in their covered wagons, were coming together for meetings and for weekly, lectures and things like that. And they developed some of the most sophisticated potential solutions to what you're talking about, to the issues that we're raising here, several of which were in fact adopted. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think what you're suggesting has tons of merit. It requires, as you said, placing society's value on something other than zeros and in bank accounts. And you mentioned the GDP. Why is not only GDP, but GDP growth the measure of the health of a country? Why couldn't we come up with a different measure which would then incentivize different types of policies? There's something else that really distressed me in doing this historical research. I asked myself, okay, how did we get out of that? Like, there was certainly a period starting around 1935-ish and running till about 1980, when constraints, without the significant changes you're talking about, but constraints were put on this runaway profit seeking, on the destruction being visited on consumers and the environment, on, the exploitation of labor. What allowed for those reforms? I had at first thought that it was the opposition movements who had succeeded. In fact, they were all destroyed before their recommendations were adopted. The 8-hour day was another one. And what it took seems to be 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and a pandemic that makes the current one look like a joke. That's 2 genocides and the use of the nuclear bomb. In other words, that system, which we are now resembling today, drove us into almost unimaginable calamities. And let's look at what we've just lived through. Again, economic meltdown that doesn't quite, it's not quite as bad as the Depression, a pandemic that's not quite as bad as the flu of 1918, 2 lost wars. Well, they weren't world wars. I mean, how big is it going to have to get before we're able to change the political economy in ways that you recommend? And my question is, are we going to be able to do it? Could we band together to make what you envisage happen before the calamity?
I think the problem, Sarah, somewhat lies in the fact that the things that you have cited as problematic, inventoried, in fact, to the interests that are most dominant in the scale, in the way that we manage society, those were beneficial. Those wars are beneficial if you're an arms manufacturer. The pandemic is beneficial if you're a pharmacological manufacturer. So, as I sort of point out often in my live work and occasionally online, the reason that change doesn't happen is because for the interests that matter, things are working okay. As a recent guest on the show, Luke Kemper, he may have been citing James C. Scott, said that it's not a bug, it's a feature. The way that things are going wrong, the problems that we're encountering, it's pretty sort of commonly understood that there's been the biggest wealth transfer in history has taken place during the last 18-month period. So from whose perspective is it a problem? It's a problem if you lost a loved one. It's a problem if you've seen your freedom impinged. It's a problem if there are measures that you don't ideologically agree with. But it ain't a problem if it's led to profit. So for me, that's an analytic tool that's always worth deploying. The commonly understood as who benefits. If someone benefits from this situation, then it's how is it a problem? How is it a problem? And if you start to think like that, people tend to start smearing you as an individual and calling you a conspiracy theorist. But that's why I'm very interested to speaking to someone with your level of experience and expertise. I'm just looking at some of the things that you've done. Like, you've worked quite closely with the military. In what capacity, given now that I've only spoken to you for 15 minutes and I'm getting an understanding of your perspective, what were they thinking when they even employed you? What capacity were you employed in?
So there you are, someone that's been right on the inside and recognises there's a lot of limitation in the discourse around these issues. I thought she was a brilliant thinker. I want to talk to her again. Tell me what kind of guests you want to see on my podcast Under the Skin, who you would like to have more insight and information from wherever they are on the political spectrum, because I reckon this is a time for us to pool our resources, put everything together and come up with new ideas in a more unified way that respects our individualism and our right to sort of tribalize and run our lives however we want to. That's just what I think, though. What do you think? Tell me in the comments below what your views are. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this one. It's very similar, a bit more saucy in some ways. If you need to meditate now, have a look at this and develop the well-being side of your nature on my Awakening side channel. Please sign up to my mailing list. It's just one click away. Consider signing up for Luminary, a podcast network where I put a lot of my content, meditation and deep interviews. Stay free.